When commanded by Pharaoh to kill all the baby boys born to the Hebrew women, they courageously defied Pharaoh, and they were faithful to God. Even in defying Pharaoh, they risked their very lives. Well, this morning we're still in the Old Testament, but we are in the book of Judges, and we'll be reading from chapter 4, verses 4 through 10. Now, I'm going to give you another little background to our passage. So the book of Judges depicts the life of God's people in the Promised Land from the point of Joshua's death to the rise of the monarchy. And the book of Judges can be described as a cycle which repeats as follows. Israelites stop following Yahweh's commands, start worshiping other gods. So God allows foreign leaders to oppress them. And so then, in their distress, the Israelites call out to God, and God answers them by sending them a judge to deliver them. And Israel would experience this time of peace and distress over and over. Judge would come, things would be great, judge would die, they get bad again, and repeat as follows. There were 12 judges, and when we think about the role of the Old Testament judge, we think of them as being kind of warrior leaders. 11 of those judges were men, but one was a woman, Deborah, and she was the 4th judge. And our passage this morning tells us about Deborah. So I'm going to be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, chapter 4, verses 4 through 10. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon, with his chariots and his troops, and I will give them into your hand." Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman." Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. Will you join me in prayer? Holy God, may your word speak to us this morning. I pray we have ears to hear your message and hearts to know your will. Amen. So, I think the text tells us 3 things about Deborah, right? First, the text tells us that she's the wife of Lapidoth. Now, in Hebrew, Lapid is translated as torch. So some scholars believe that when they say that she's the wife of Lapidoth, what it means is that that's the name of her husband. But others believe that that is translated to mean torch bearer. It really doesn't have any meaning that she's actually married. So either way, we don't really know whether the reference in Scripture is to an actual man or to about Deborah's role. Now, it would really be nice to know that, I think, and especially to know a little bit about him, because it would have been impossible for her to do the things that she has done without a husband who would have been in support of her. Obviously, if men and women were coming to Deborah for advice, her husband would have had to have been supporting her, not been opposed to that. Secondly, it tells us that she's a prophetess. So what does it mean to be a prophetess? The word prophet, or nabi, in Hebrew means to bubble forth, like from a fountain. So a prophet was a person who spoke for God. The prophets whom God raised up among his people were called to correct moral and religious abuses, to proclaim the great moral and religious truths which were connected to the character of God, and which lie the very foundation of his government. So, she was only one of 3 prophetess identified in the Old Testament, along with Miriam in Exodus 15 and Huldah in the 2nd Kings. So in other words, Deborah was called by God to bring God's message to God's people. When the Hebrew people turned away from God, God used Deborah to tell his people not only what they were doing wrong, but also to tell them what God wanted them to do. So we saw in verse 6, Deborah calls Barak, who's one of the commanders of the army, and tells him what God has commanded him to do. Now, Barak already knows what God has commanded him to do. It's more like Deborah's reminding him, this is what God wants you to do. He wants you to take 10, and we don't know if it's 10,000, 10 different, we're not really sure, but to take 10 and take those troops to Mount Tabor, and God was going to actually hand over the enemy to him. God was going to bring the enemies to him if you just went like God told him to do. And that Barak would be successful in conquering the Hebrew people's enemy. God gave the message to Deborah, and she turned and said to Barak what God had told her. But in order for Deborah to know what God had told Barak to do, she had to listen to God. So Deborah must have been a very thoughtful and spiritual woman. She had to have been spending time in study and meditation and prayer. And she was called by God to turn the Hebrew people away from their wicked, immoral ways so that they could once again worship God and follow God's law. Speaking of law, she was a judge. Now, we're all pretty familiar with how judges work today, and in many ways she was similar to that. She would sit under this palm tree, called the Deborah palm, and she would have people come to her for judgment. She would probably have decided petty arguments between people about who sheep belonged to who and other issues like that. She would offer advice on how to handle issues between people, and she would also dole out punishments. Deborah would have been the interpreter of the law, and she would tell people, men and women, what they ought to be doing. So we were talking the other day in a youth group. Colby and Helen and I were talking a little bit about reading some books in the Old Testament. We talked about the book of Leviticus. Now, if any of you have worked your way through the book of Leviticus, it's a painful experience. And we as Christians really think about 10 commandments, right? The 10 that Moses gave. But Jewish tradition teaches there are 613 different laws. And these are laws about food, caring for the less fortunate, worshiping God, business practices, celebrating the Sabbath, what you're supposed to wear, etc., etc. And Deborah would have had to have known not only about the laws, but she would have also had to have the wisdom to judge fairly when people didn't follow God's laws. It seems that Deborah was much like, as I said, judges today. Other Hebrew judges, well, they had more military skills and responsibilities. Deborah seems to be more on the academic side and the not military side of that. But we notice in the passage that despite the fact that she was not a military leader planning military battles, she was willing to go into battle right alongside of Barak and the many men he took, because he required her presence to follow God's command, and she was willing to do that in order for God's will to be seen. So she obviously had many gifts. She was a prophet who brought the messages from God. She was a judge who settled matters of law, and a leader, along with Barak, who delivered her people from oppression. Deborah wasn't afraid to follow God's commands, and she even risked death in order to save her people. Now it's funny, we didn't read that part in the passage, we didn't go farther in the story, but if you know, when Deborah says that Barak would not be the one who would finally cause the victory, she said a woman would. She was not speaking about herself. She was speaking about another woman who would have the courage to drive a stake through the enemy's head. Two of the well-known Hebrew judges that I'm sure that any of you have been to Sunday school or Bible school would be familiar with are Gideon and Samson. We read stories of Gideon and his fleece and Samson and his weakness, Delilah, not really his hair. Yet Deborah's story is important in our faith, just as important as these two judges. I believe that there are several things that we can learn about God and our place in God's plan from Deborah's story. One of the first things I think we can learn is that God does unexpected things. A woman called to share God's message with God's people. Rather unexpected thing in 12,000 BC. Women weren't in charge. Men owned the property. Men made the decisions. Men governed. And then God says, Deborah, I have a plan to redeem my people, and you're in a part of my plan. And I don't know, does this sound familiar? Another young woman who God said, I have a plan, and you're a big part of that plan. Mary? Over and over again when we read God's word, we see God doing wonderful things, and they're done in unexpected ways. And even more amazing to me, God opened the hearts of the people to receive Deborah's prophecy and her judgments. He didn't just call her, he changed the hearts of people so that they could hear what she had to share. I believe God still does unexpected things. And I believe that God works through rather ordinary people to do extraordinary things. I'm going to pronounce this name wrong because French is not one of my languages. But when Gonxa left her home in September of 1928 to join the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, she couldn't have known the number of lives that she would touch, nor that she would be canonized by Pope Francis on September 4th, 2016. We know her as Sister Mother Teresa. Or how about when Bart Millard sat down to write the song, I Can Only Imagine? And there was no way he was going to know the ways that song was going to touch the lives of people. Through God, nothing is impossible. It seems that today we don't notice the things that God is doing in the lives of people. Like, for example, in the last 100 years, things exist now that didn't exist then. You imagine if I asked you to do a list, you'd think, well, computers, right? Microwaves, cell phones, things that our teenagers can't imagine life without. But did you also know that sliced bread, car window wipers, Post-it notes and Brillo pads didn't exist 100 years ago either. Neither did dialysis or fetal ultrasound or CT scanners or penicillin. These are wonderful, miraculous technologies and things that we have available to us today. Millions of people are alive today because of vaccines. According to the U.S. Census, the average life expectancy at the beginning of the 20th century was 47.3 years. Today, it's approximately 78.6, almost twice as long. Some don't see these advancements in medicine and technology as God working in the lives of people. Why don't we? Have we become so jaded that we're not able to see God's miracles today? God gives inventors the intelligence, the opportunities, and the desire to create new and exciting things. And God gives doctors and surgeons and other healers the talents, the skills, and the compassion to help others. But God doesn't just work in these great, big, huge, exciting ways, but in simple yet important ways every day. And we need to just open our eyes and see, and our hearts to know all of the things that God is doing and how God's moving and working in God's people. I think from Deborah, we can also see that God gives his people for the work they're called to do. People wouldn't have come to her for counsel if she wasn't wise and knowledgeable. Barak wouldn't have requested her presence in battle if he didn't trust the fact that she knew what God wanted. If she was beside him, God would do what God had promised. And even though at times it seems that God asks us to do things that are difficult or frightening or almost impossible, God gives us the talent and the resources and the skills to follow our call. And God doesn't call everyone to be prophets or preachers or missionaries. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't call each of us to touch the lives of the people around us, our family, people we work with, our neighbors. Deborah is an example of someone who puts her gifts to work in unforeseen, creative, and inspiring ways. But I believe in order to recognize the gifts that God has given us, we need a few things. First, we need opportunities to try new things. LeBron James wouldn't have become one of the greatest basketball players if nobody had ever handed him a ball and gave him the opportunity to learn how to play the game. When we try new things, we discover what we're terrible at. But other times, we discover what we're good at. It's funny. All of our children were given the opportunity to play sports, to take music lessons, to do the things they were interested in doing, whether it was scouting or art. We discovered quickly that some of our children were gifted in different areas and other areas not so much. But they were given the chance to try. But I think we also need cheerleaders and we need coaches. We need people that help us hone those skills and people to cheer us on, even when we fail. We fall flat on our faces and they're there to tell us it's okay, get back up and try again. We encourage each other and we help each other discover our gifts and our passions. But we also need a little bit of courage. Sometimes trying something new is scary. And you know what? It's not so much fun to fail. But God gives us talents and gifts so that we might build God's kingdom here on earth today. Don't ever think that that gift isn't good enough, it isn't important enough, or it isn't necessary for God's plan. As the famous saying goes, God doesn't make mistakes. Another thing that we can learn, I think, from Deborah's story is that when God looks at us, God doesn't see gender, or skin color, or age, political stance, or IQ. Humans are the ones that put people into boxes. We want to categorize people based upon who they were born to, where they grew up, how much education they have, or whether they're male or female. We're the ones that categorize people. God doesn't. I think God only cares about our hearts. God cares if we're seeking to do His will, whether we're worshiping Him with our hearts and our minds, and whether we're caring for the least of these, our brothers and sisters. That's what matters to God. I think every day, every hour, every minute, God is speaking to all of us, waiting for us to listen. I think the problem is we don't listen. And I'm super guilty of this one. We rush around filling our days with tasks that need to be done, or we're looking to be entertained because we don't know how to be still and just be. Yet, when we take the time to stop and to listen, I believe God will show us how we're a part of God's story. And even when we put conditions on obeying God, just like Barak did, we'll do this if, I'll do this if, God is still going to use us, even when we do that. I think each of us has a special place in God's story. And when we're willing to be like Deborah, God can use us to build his kingdom here on earth. It's hard, I think, to turn off the distractions that we face every day. Sean and I, we like to watch Netflix. Kind of like the kids in my youth group, sometimes we'll binge a TV show. Our current binging is The Good Place. And I'll even find myself with my iPad in my hand. So here are John and I watching TV. We each have our iPad in our hands, and we're either, playing a game or reading emails or doing something else at the same time. And I'm just like, we are so ingrained to always be doing something that it's hard to just be. But I believe that God speaks to us all the time, even in that busyness. But I think that when we stop and listen, we'll hear that God has wonderful things to tell us. So I think from the story of Deborah, who is in a very short passage in the book of Judges, in a long book of stories about God's plan, we can learn some important things. And I hope that that's true when we read other passages in the Bible and other stories, that those stories about God and God working in the lives of God's people mean something for the way God's working in God's people today. And I hope that it also means that we're willing to share with people how we see God moving in our lives, in the lives of people that we care about. Because I think that's the way that we teach people about Jesus. We're not going to have a lot of luck, I don't think, teaching people about Jesus when we stand in front of them with the Bible in our hand and we try to hit them over the head with it, which is what I think, we tend to do when we think we're called to tell people about Jesus. We want to do all the steps to tell people about Jesus. But I think the way that we really can tell people about Jesus is by showing them how they can be a part of God's plan and how that story is important in their lives as much as it is.
We make a miracle walking, promise keeper, light in the darkness. That is who you are. We make a miracle walking, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. You wipe away all tears. You mend the broken heart. You're the answer to it all.